Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the NAACP Forum. We are Brockton's Choice for Civil Rights News. Joining me in the studio today, now let me just say this. I see royalty here.
Oh my.
I see someone that is in charge. I see academics. I see it all. Welcome to Karima Lewis of Holbrook. However, we're getting her into Brockton. Karima, welcome to the studio today.
Thank
How
you.
are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
So listen, rumor is that you're here to talk about 400 years of African history. Is that true?
That's true.
Well, before we talk about that, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. I am a native of New York City, and
Which borough? Don't
Brooklyn,
Brooklyn,
New
all
York.
right, Brooklyn's in the house. Okay.
Yes, and decided after 2 other careers as a school social worker and an attorney that I wanted to study history. So I decided to pursue a doctorate degree in history when I was in my mature years.
What does that mean, mature
years?
As young as you are, stop.
And I got a degree in African American history from University of California, Berkeley.
Wow.
And my area of study is New England slavery. And so I decided I would come and live in New England because that's what I specialize in. So I've been here for 7 years. This month makes 7 years that I've been in the area, and I've really put down some roots here and have been enjoying my stay here. I do teach American history and African American history at Quincy College and Emerson College in Boston.
So we should be addressing you as Professor Lewis or Dr. Lewis.
Ms. Lewis is fine.
Ms. Lewis is fine?
So,
We're
yes.
going to address you as Queen because you sure look like royalty today.
Thank you.
So tell us, when there have been, as you know, there's been folks that have tried to revisit the history of slavery in the United States. Give us a detailed opinion. When did slavery actually start in the United States of America?
I think that you're asking a question that could be asked in another way, and it's when did the first Africans come to North America? And so, or when did slavery first start? If we ask the first question, when did Africans first come here? They came with the Spanish as early as the 1500s. And so there were Africans in North America with the Spanish from that early date. Now, many of them came as servants and soldiers along with the conquistadors or the explorers. But we date the first enslaved people as coming to Jamestown in 1619.
Well, wait a minute now. So let's talk a little bit about those that arrived with the Spaniards. They arrived as free individuals. Is that what you're saying?
They arrived as mostly soldiers with the Spanish conquerors.
And what does that mean? Were they free?
Probably not. Probably not, but they would have gotten their freedom. Some of them stayed in some of the Spanish colonies and would have gotten their freedom. You got to understand that the Spanish system and the French system were quite different from the English system.
Okay.
They had avenues that you could get your freedom. You could save your money. The master had to allow you to save your money to be able to get to buy your freedom. So if they were not free when they got here, when they settled here, they would eventually be free.
So historically, there is a valid argument to say that Africans that arrived here in North America were not necessarily slaves, and that they were able to have children, get married, et cetera, et cetera. So is it fair to say that all of us weren't slaves in North America?
That's a very good question, because even the first 20 or so that came to Jamestown were not in bondage as bondage came to look. That's lifetime servitude.
Right.
They were more, because there were no system of laws in Virginia for slavery in 1619.
No codes.
No codes,
right.
No laws. They were more like indentured servants.
Uh-oh.
Yes, they were more like indentured servants. And so let's talk about these first 20 that came to Jamestown. The The first 20 that came, we know that they came from West Central Africa. They came from a place called Luanda in Angola. They came on a Dutch ship that an English crew and captain who were sailing under a Dutch flag, but they were English people that were sailing the ship. And basically what had happened is this Portuguese ship had left Luanda, Angola, and had about 200 slaves in the ship. They meet close to the Gulf of Mexico. They were on their way to a place in Mexico called Veracruz, and the two English ships attacked the Portuguese ship and forced 50 to 60 off the ship. And it's those two English ships flying under the Dutch flag that come to Jamestown and bring those first enslaved people. But because there's no system of slavery, they're only indentured servants in Virginia. Tobacco is beginning to be the main crop, and that's what the indentured servants are working at. That's what the slaves, they might have been called slaves, but they were not treated as slaves. And so we always feature a particular African that came a couple of years after 1619, and his name was Anthony Johnson. Now, when he arrived in Virginia, he had lived in Angola under the Portuguese. The Portuguese had been in West Africa for over a century by the time this occurs. They had come to West Africa from the 1500s. And so most of the Africans that came, that 20 or so, they had already converted to Catholicism. They knew how to speak Portuguese. They had taken Portuguese names. So Anthony Johnson was really Antonio when he arrived in Virginia. And Antonio Johnson will marry Maria, someone who came around the same time that he did. He will gain his freedom. He will be able to buy 250 acres of land on the Eastern Shore. He will have his own indentured servants and slaves that he will own and work.
Can you just explain to the audience, you said indentured servant and you're saying slavery. What's the difference between the two?
Okay, so let's go back. Okay, so indentured servitude, mostly whites from Europe, wanted to come to America. They're very poor. There had been a population explosion. Nobody could find work. And so they had no money to come over. And so the planters, tobacco planters, rice planters in South Carolina, tobacco planters in Virginia would pay the passage of these poor whites to come over and work on their plantations in North America. The way that they would pay the planter back is to work for 5 to 7 years, a term of 5 to 7 years, and when that term is over, they are free. But in the early days, they also, when they were free, they got what's called freedom dues, and so they got land, they got tools, and so they were put in a good place when they finished. Slavery is lifetime servitude. You will not be free during your lifetime unless your master frees you, unless you run away, which many of them did. So you will not have freedom unless it's granted legally or you take things into your own hand and you run away.
So it looks like what you're saying, so Anthony Johnson, Antonio Johnson arrives to our shores, and he looks like he becomes successful. What has happened to his lineage? Do you know?
Well, we know that he will move from the Eastern Shore on the Virginia side to the Maryland side. His sons will also own land. And once they move, he dies in 1670. And once he dies, his sons did have land, but we don't know what happens to the legacy after that.
What do you find significant about the progress? It says, you know, I love this poster that Phyllis, our president, has done here. It says 1619 is the anniversary of Africans in the United States, but that's not the whole story. This is not enough time to talk about the whole story,
right.
But what are some of the highlights of the story about our ancestors in this country?
Okay, so once let's just start with Virginia. By 1670, slavery had hardened. There are laws.
Define hardened. Define hardened. What do you mean?
Hardened would mean you could be an indentured servant in 1620.
Right, right.
But by 1670, everybody's a lifetime slave.
Okay.
And there are laws that control it. You can't run away. You could lose an ear if you ran away. You could lose a limb.
So the codes were, so by your estimate, the codes had already been developed for that sort of punishment in the United States.
This is when it becomes practice that if a child is born to an enslaved woman, then that child is a slave. Before that, that was not the law. But by 1670, Virginia will take its slave laws from the island of Barbados.
Really?
Yes. And so we know in the Caribbean where the laws were much more harsh, the work was much more exacting because sugar cultivation is a very, very demanding type of crop production. So by that time, 1670, we move into the 1700s. We have enslaved people coming not only to the southern plantation, but there's slavery in the north as well. And by 1638,
but not here in Massachusetts, though.
By 1630.
Oh, she said, wait, come on, let's go on a record here. In the Commonwealth, are you saying that no, wait a minute, no.
By 1638, the first enslaved people will be brought to the colony of Massachusetts.
Oh.
By 1750, we would say the numbers are around 20,000 in all of New
I beg your
England.
pardon?
20,000 enslaved people. It doesn't compare to the South.
It doesn't. No.
The
But
South.
we hear, and you know this, Professor. We hear great things about the Northern fight against slavery, and you're telling me there was 20,000 of us.
20 by 1750.
Wow. Okay.
Massachusetts, that by that time had about 5,000. Rhode Island had 6,000. Connecticut led it with over 6,000 because they did have farms and small plantations in Connecticut because they grew more crops than, say,
Okay, so when a lot of people that I speak to try to balance the harshness of the southern slave trade versus the northern, were they equally as harsh, or were the northerners more? And I know this is going to sound weird, softer on us.
No, we say it's a benign system of slavery in the North.
Okay.
Because in the North, you could become educated, you could learn to read and write. You didn't go to school, but you could learn to read and write if you're a master.
But how did they learn then?
The master would teach them.
Okay.
Take the case of Phyllis Wheatley.
Right.
Well-known poet. By the time she's 20, her master and mistress allowed their daughter to teach her how to read. So by the time she's 12 or 14, she's reading the classics.
Right.
And she's educated. But you couldn't do that. It wasn't against the law like it was in the South.
Gotcha.
You could marry legally in the North, but you could not in the South.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about marriage now. Marry who or whom? Marry our own blackness, or we did interracial marriage?
No, interracial marriage
was
is
not allowed in the
law.
North.
Against
Against
in
the
the
law.
North and the South.
Okay.
It's against the law.
Okay.
Yeah, but you do have some unions between Native Americans, particularly in Massachusetts, Wampanoags, as well as the Mashpee. You have African men marrying Indian women because of a shortage of African women during that time.
Oh, wow.
But so there are, I always like to say, a taste of freedom in the North, but it's not to say that they weren't punished, they weren't beat, they weren't worked hard, and that they didn't have their freedom. In my own work, I look at how enslaved people in New England contested slavery by setting fires.
Well, tell us a little bit about, wait a minute, hold it. Wait a minute. We're not suggesting arson as a, so tell us a little bit about that.
It's a form of resistance.
Yes, right.
There's many forms of resistance. I teach my students there's passive resistance and there's active resistance.
Amen.
Okay, so passive, I might break a tool, hurt an animal, pretend I'm sick when I'm not sick.
Right.
Pretend I'm crazy when I'm not crazy.
Right.
Okay, passive. Active, murder, poison, arson.
That was what
assault.
we were doing that?
Yes, we
oh my
were.
Goodness. We were a tough
We were.
group.
See, they like to compare
They talk
the
about
Americans
people.
to the Caribbeans. So, you know,
Yeah.
Caribbeans were always rebelling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we had, think of Haiti.
Right, right.
They set themselves free.
They did.
Okay,
They most
talk
certainly
about-
did.
We
Right.
have 500,000, but they like to say Americans were a little more complacent. But in my work, I seek to debunk that because we did protest. So yeah, it was benign in the North, but there was resistance. And so we go on. By the American Revolution, after the Revolution, we do have the North abolishing slavery. And so in the North, but that doesn't mean that the newly freed in the North, they can't find work. Even if they're educated, they can't find work. And so they're very poor. And many of them will move around to different states to be able to find better opportunities. But we have, of course, slavery continuing in the South after the American Revolution, and the writing of the Constitution, the one opportunity this country had to free the almost 500,000 enslaved people that you had at that time. And so we move into the 1800s, and we have the discovery of the cotton gin, and we have the growing of cotton in what we call the Southwest areas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. And then we have what we call the second Middle Passage, because we have a movement of 1 million enslaved Americans in the South, in Virginia, in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that are moved to the middle of the country to grow this cotton. 1 million people.
You're saying move versus migrate. Why are you using move versus migrate?
I'm using moves because the master moved them.
Because they literally, okay, all right.
And what happened is that the men were moved first, so sons and husbands were torn from their families so that they could go to this fertile land that's being developed in the middle of the country to prepare these cotton plantations.
I'm sorry, Professor, I have to interrupt you. You're telling me that the black man was made absent from his family, and that happened when again?
That's like 1800s.
Are you really?
Early 1800s.
Now she's telling the truth here now. She knows what she's talking about, but go ahead, please.
So, and it continues, and we know that because of cotton becoming king, they're just moving more and more. So I like to tell people that you might have people in Mississippi and in Arkansas and places like that. Those people initially came from Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, South Carolina. So we have cousins that we don't even know because of this forced migration that our people underwent during this early 1800s. And we know the years leading up to the Civil War, the Dred Scott case that comes before the Civil War. Dred Scott abolitionists helped him bring a case because he had lived in free territory. There was a portion right after the American Revolution, the Northwest territories, where there was never slavery. We're talking about Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and that Northwest area. So he had lived there for...
Can I ask you a question? Because I remember somebody was talking to me about this last year. How was it possible that those that Northwest corridor of the United States didn't have slavery? Have you looked into that? Why is it just...
Because this is the first, this Northwest Ordinance was passed before we even had a constitution under the Articles of Confederation. It's the first thing that the Congress does after the war, and they know that slavery is going to continue, but they just carve out this. I think basically the government wanted to end slavery. The federal government wanted to end it, but the power of those Southern planters prevented that.
The power of the Southern planters or the power of industry? I mean, it was the industry.
Well, the Southern planters industry that was making them wealthy, yes.
Very wealthy.
Very wealthy.
You have
extremely
a position,
wealthy.
I know that we're told 10 more minutes. You have a position on reparations?
Well,
I have to throw that one.
But I didn't. Okay, let me just finish Civil War.
I know you want to finish that, but that's coming now.
The Civil War is fought.
Yeah.
Jim Crow, okay,
Yep.
that our people experienced, the lynching, the segregation, the denials of education, all of that during that period, leading up to the 20th century, all of that from the beginning, 1619, slavery that continues through the Southwest and the development of cotton cultivation, the movement of 1 million people that displaces families forever.
Why did you just say, Professor, you just said something that's so compelling. You said for displaces families forever.
Forever.
Why do you say that?
I say that I can say even for my own family that you can meet people with your same name.
Wow.
And you know, I've done research when I meet somebody with the same name that my grandmother had.
Yes.
And I found out that, and I'm talking about Manny Marable, that many of the audience might know. That's my family name. And Professor Marable's and my family are related in some way because their slave owners were brothers. But his family went to Alabama and my family stayed in Virginia. And so I'm saying these are families that will never know that connection unless maybe we can do some DNA eventually. So that happened across the board for most African American families.
So you just mentioned DNA, and I'm still going to go to my reparations thing there, but so have you done, so I've done 23andMe, and it's giving me the breakdown. I'm 12% Irish, 70%.
12%.
Yeah, I don't know, it's giving me all this stuff here. Now, first of all, have you done it?
I've done both.
What have you found out?
I'm 30%, 37% Nigerian.
Wow.
Both tests. I wanted to confirm it.
So that's what I did both.
Yeah.
So did you get the list of all those names? And as the list goes, your cousins? And then your second and third and fourth?
I didn't get into all that.
Yeah,
No, not
I'm like
yet.
up to 1,000 cousins now. Majority of my cousins are white.
Yeah.
So
But
it's very interesting.
I'm 17% white. But I'm 82% African.
There you go. Hey.
And sometimes, you would look at me and say, you're 82%. But because I'm
Why do you say, no, wait a minute. Why do you say that?
Because of my skin color.
Because of your skin color, okay.
Right? But I believe I'm from the Igbo tribe. And I don't like to say tribe, but the Igbos. And
wait a minute, you go too fast here. Why don't you like to say tribe? Because you're teaching us. So why don't you like to say tribe?
Because I think that's a name that has been put on. The grouping of Africans and the grouping of Native Americans as well.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you.
That's an English imposition. Yeah. And so Igbo people, they can be on the lighter side complexion. So 82% is a lot of Africans. So I'm really proud of that. But reparations, there is no question that for all that we have endured over the 400 years of living in this country, from the forced migration from our homeland, from the losing of our names, our connections to our African families and our African roots, from the loss of our language, to the enslavement that we endured for over 400 years, to the forced migration from the South to the Southwest, Jim Crow, lynching, segregated schools, denial of employment.
Wow, yes.
And I can go on and on and on. And we know what's going on today.
Right.
Yes, we have a right for reparations. We were talking about it in the conference I attended in Africa, and somebody said, well, we don't want to give a check. Well, I got up.
Is that you just coming back? So she's just coming back from Ghana. So is this?
Well, this was just one individual was saying.
Well, no, but it's part of that because we haven't covered your travel to Ghana.
That's I have my little manifest.
Well, show. Can you all see this?
This was
Ghana's
way of commemorating the 400 years and inviting people of the diaspora. Not only from the United States, but also from the Caribbean and South America to return. So they call it the Year of the Return in Ghana. And this Panifest is like Pan-African joining together of people from across the diaspora. And so the discussion of reparations.
You said returning to Ghana, though. Is that true?
Well, I have
because people have I've heard a lot of arguments in the
I
last
just told
10
you.
years.
Huh?
I've heard a lot of argument in the last 10 years. Where should we be going?
Well, okay, we're West African.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
we're West African.
Yep.
The 12 million primarily came from West Africa. There was a few from East Africa, Madagascar, but not significant numbers. And so,
I mean, we appreciate it.
Right. We say thank you.
We say thank you.
But when I tell you I'm 30% Nigerian, I'm going to Nigeria next year.
Hello.
Okay.
Oh my God, we love you. We love you.
And so the question comes up,
Yeah.
should we give a check or should we fund education? Or someone at the conference said we should build up the infrastructure of black communities. And I told them there's very few black communities left here in America because of gentrification.
You know what? People don't realize that. People really don't realize that we're becoming dinosaurs as a community. Let's be honest about it. But.
And so my contribution at that conference, I said, look, everybody else got a check, right?
It is true, historically true.
Holocaust, Jewish survivors, their descendants to this day get a check from Germany for the Holocaust.
Right.
The Japanese got 20,000
each. Yeah, I know.
each.
Yeah.
So why can't we get a check? And let me spin it the way I want to spin it.
So put on your legal hat, though, Professor. So how does such first? Do you have a dollar? So they say
no, I don't.
So you don't have a dollar.
No,
you're
I
not
don't
going
have
to go to the trillion.
No,
but how do we figure out if it were to happen? I know that there's a presidential candidate that's out there is making suggestions that it goes to a commission and the commission disperses it to African Americans. I don't know if you have a thought on that. If you want to comment on that.
No, I
happen?
just think that it's time to put the issue on the table.
So it's time to have the
study
conversation
it.
and
If you
study
don't
it.
have the conversation, if you don't have the study of it,
Right.
you can't make a decision about it because it's never been put on the table.
Right.
And it's just time,
Wow.
So that's my feeling.
That's your, so I'm going to be getting a check soon. I know that's horrible.
Like
horrible.
What was interesting about the trip and the conference?
Tell us about
we
it.
had a lot of African Americans who are living in Ghana who had said goodbye United States, and I am going to West Africa to live. There's 7,000.
You're going?
No, not me. I said there are African Americans,
I got that.
Right,
All right,
who have left the United States and said goodbye.
So have they given up their citizenship, or they just have the dual citizenship? Because I know that's being offered.
I
by a
think
lot
in
of
the
African
beginning,
countries.
this is just the beginning of dual.
Yep.
So, and say they've been, met one woman who's been there since the 90s. She gave up her citizenship.
And I recently saw, I know we're short for time. I recently saw a special on PBS where folks have become, I think they call them expatriates, whatever the lingo that they're using.
Or repatriates.
But they were explaining that Africans consider them to be white.
Oh, we don't want to touch that one.
Yeah,
I think we
I'm
need
trying to figure that one out. I'm like, so we got to have you back. We got to have you back. We have Professor Karima Lewis that has come here. She's a member of the Brockton New Life AME Zion, so she's one of us.
Yes.
She's one of ours. We love her. So this was really terrific. You've given us a lot of information. Anything you want to say in closing, besides you're going to Nigeria?
Well, I think during this year of remembering the 400 years,
Yes.
we don't really have to always focus on the trauma and the horrors.
Thank you.
Because we say African people living in America, not so much African Americans, but Africans living in America, we've contributed so much to this culture, to this nation, to building this country, that we should be proud that we have made that contribution, and we are strong, resilient people who have been able to survive and are still standing. So hold your head up high.
Hold your head up
because
high.
you come from royalty and you come from a greatness that you don't even know about.
Thank you,
So
Dr.
thank you.
Lewis. Professor Karima Lewis brought it to us. 400 years of African history. We are the NAACP Forum. We are Brockton's Choice with Civil Rights News. Thank you.
Thank you.